Once again, this is Joe from Rick Productions, here this time to bring you a rant video. Even though it's not really a rant video, it's an observation of things, but he's probably might to some degree come off as a rant. But without any further ado, please do me a favor. Like this video. If you can, share it to all your friends, and don't forget to subscribe. And also hit the notifications, and because this is a rant video you might be interested in, please comment, so that way we can kind of get this going, we can get this video pushed up, and also help build the channel as we go along. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to build this channel up severely. You know, I want to be first of all, I want to be thankful of the 14 people that have subscribed to the channel. I really appreciate you, and you don't realize how much I love you, and in doing that for me and show me that love. But we need more people, so if you can pass on this channel to everybody else, we'll be able to kind of see this channel grow together. Remember, this is a community channel, so we're gonna do whatever we can to kind of bring everything together. So without any further ado, let's get into it. As many of us have probably watched a lot of videos, you know, there'll be sometimes really certain videos that'll go viral. Now, if you've seen my other video, which is right up here, that video talked about the music scene. It talked about the music business and how the way it's turned out in some of those other things. I listen to certain points of view, and a lot of times they're usually within the same thing, or the same conclusion, shall I say. But a few weeks ago, Rick Beato went on a rant, and he put it on this video. And when people saw the video, there were certain people whose hair was set on fire when they watched that particular video. Rick took pot shots of the way of today's music, and also even to some bits of the recording process of today's music. In response, there were very many YouTubers that were making videos explaining why Rick was wrong. Some had good points. Some missed the point of what Rick was thinking. And at times, there were some that were very condescending to Rick. But there was a few YouTubers that stood up, understood the conversation, did their best to make the best of both sides of the argument. And in my case, this is what this video is for. Just because somebody who may come off as a boomer may say something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. From the perspective that I have, if I'm correct, Rick Beato is like a late boomer, early Gen Xer. Me, I'm a total Gen Xer. Not just that, being a musician and an up-and-coming audio engineer, and through that, hopefully, that my life's experience can bring an understanding to the argument and hopefully bring these both worlds together. And let's start with this one thing: perspective. Each generation grew up listening to certain types of music. Now we think of the lost generation. We think of the greatest generation, the silent generation. Those generations had jazz, they had blues, they had folk music, and some even early forms of rock music. You think of Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, and the Pacemakers. You think of also of Elvis. You think of all those guys when it came to the early forms of rock music. Then you had the boomer generation. The boomer generation, they caught on to what was going on. They were listening to rock that was evolving. You know, you got like Fats Domino's, the Beach Boys, then also you had Jimi Hendrix. But also in all that, you also had the evolution of other music as well, such as rhythm and blues, or R&B as it's known as, which featured artists such as Marvin Gaye, Al Green. Then you also obviously heard of the Motown scene, like Diana Ross and the Supremes. But also there was the emergence of funk music, which featured Parliament, Funkadelic, and James Brown. Then as we go into the 70s, you're going to have what they call the singer-songwriter era, which was recognized by James Taylor and Carly Simon. Also, at the time, you got to see the birth of a new genre of music, and that is disco. When the 80s came around, Generation X, my generation, experienced an explosion of various types of music. In our time, there was punk rock, there was alternative rock, or new wave, as I remember calling it at one time, or as some of my friends at the time called it. You saw the expansion of the rock category. You saw bands like, you heard of genres like heavy metal, hard rock, progressive rock. And also you had disco music that was evolving and became club music as we knew it as, or dance music, which eventually evolved into what we know now as EDM, or electronic dance music. At the time also, pop music was accelerating in speed. And also you had the emergence of yacht rock. You probably think of bands like Pablo Cruz, you think of Ambrosia, you think of the Bee Gees, all that stuff. The Bee Gees came around in the disco era, but they also had other songs as well. And what even made this generation and our generation more significant, and let alone the 80s significant, was the explosion of MTV music. And music videos became a part of what the music landscape was at that time. Now, as far as the millennials, the Gen Z generation, there was still an evolution of music in the landscape. But as far as what I've noticed, my perspective in it all, it was more gadget driven, if anything. Products like laptops, cell phones, tablets became eventually more in commonplace. And something Rick pointed out also as well, you had the birth of social media like MySpace. I don't know how many remember that. There's also Facebook, Twitter, or now known as X, and you also have now TikTok. Those new social media platforms became the new public square of conversation. And also what I've also noticed is that the explosion of independent artistry. You think of guys like DJ Khaled that exploded on Instagram. Now you also got SoFi.io and B4Pin now on TikTok. So when you get to see the music of the millennial generation, it's all becoming more digital, and it's becoming more fast-paced, and it's coming out more than ever, which allows the independent artist to be able to generate income, and let alone to be noticed a lot quicker and achieve the dream of being a music star. In the raging debate regarding of music, it's always been revolved around the substance of music. Now, yeah, we heard the old arguments about, what people say about the older music, or some of the older music, is that it's not really appealing, or even what I would say, even as I hear some of today's music, is that, I don't know, it feels hollow. Something's missing with it. This argument has always been around for every generation. Let me give you an example. My dad, my dear old dad, who is 76 years old, grew up listening to the Beatles. He grew up listening to Jimi Hendrix. He grew up listening to the Kingston Trio, Louie, Louie, Wild Thing, the Trogs. You've heard all those songs, and even you had Nancy Sinatra coming out with her song, which is, Boots. You had all that music that was coming out. And my dad grew up under classic rock like Led Zeppelin. When I started coming up, my dad had a hard time trying to embrace that, because my mom always complained about, Joe's listening to heavy metal, things like that. So, I grew up under Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Def Leppard, the British metal invasion at the time. You also had you had Motley Crue, you had Quiet Riot, you had all those bands that were coming out, and that was something my dad had a hard time trying to absorb. Nowadays, when me and my dad talk, now he mentions he's embraced Adele, and he's also embraced Nickelback. It takes a while for certain things to change and for certain artists to kind of grab our attention when we get into the newer forms of music. Me, as far as some of the newer stuff, I'll admit, I dig the Killers and Imagine Dragons. Let me go ahead and sum it up in the way one person said this. The British singer-songwriter and fellow YouTuber Mary Spender, shall I say, explained it this explained this in her one short, which is called "Why Music Sucks."
New music has always represented modernity. Ragtime, jazz, and rock and roll all represented a break with the conventions of the past and a drive towards something new and different. The beauty of music and its history is that each new revolution doesn't need to wipe the slate of what's come before it clean. It doesn't need to undo it and replace it. They exist together in perpetuity, waiting to be discovered and rediscovered.
Remember, as I mentioned earlier in some points of my video, music evolves and it morphoses into a more better version of itself. So it is okay at times to be picky about the music that we listen to. But what we are really looking for are songs or artists that connect with us. As I mentioned earlier about my dad, he likes Adele. He likes Nickelback. Me, as I mentioned, I like Imagine Dragons, and I also like The Killers. Now, if you really listen to the heart of the argument of what this whole video that Rick created, it was all based on this one thing: technology. Obviously, right now, there's a lot of fists flying about how technology has turned the record industry on its head. As I was an up-and-coming musician in the late 80s, early 90s, I tried the garage band thing. You know, back in high school, you try to get together with old friends, you try to find bandmates, you try to collaborate with other musicians to try to create music. Well, in my case, pretty much went nowhere. But I still had that desire to drive to want to be a music creator. I discovered a new technology that helped me as a songwriter to create music I wanted to play. At that time, the technology was called the Musical Instrument Digital Interface, or MIDI as it's known as. Now that technology, since that time, has become my best friend. Even until now in my music journey, I still use MIDI because that's the best way I can be able to convey a lot of what's in my head and also being able to put it on tape as I begin to create music either for myself or in collaboration with others. Now, the question is this: was it meant to replace people? No. Technology at the time helped me get an idea out to other musicians, as I mentioned, to give them an idea that's what's in my head. When I look back in when I was a bedroom musician, it cost me a lot of money because I had to invest in a 4-track recorder. I had to invest in a keyboard or a sound module, or I had to also invest in a sequencer. And all those things that I used, I was able to create music in my bedroom. But now today, what we have going on as far as technology is concerned is extremely accessible, even from an economical standpoint. You got DAWs that aren't even costing that much anymore. Like, for example, I use Reaper, and then there's other ones out there that are probably even some free programs you could even find. Now, you also got donationware or freeware, which you find sometimes some of them come with nag screens where they want you to chip in and they want you to help them to support to be able to build more technology, which can be free at your assessment. Now, you could also be able to get controllers for about $100. You can be able to get interfaces for almost $50, around that price. You can get all those things with today's technology, and it's closer than we think. So when you think about the bedroom musician back in my day, it's no different than the musician of today. When it comes to technology, it's, especially in music, it's supposed to be a tool to help us become better musicians and to ease our workflow. Somehow, we found ourselves letting technology do all the work for us. You hear of even some prominent audio engineers would say that the music sounds stale and relax something. They sound just like everyone else. Now, the reason why is because you have what they call the development of templates and presets. Now, the use of templates and presets do help speed up the process of music recording, but they become, after a while, the only thing that creates the sound. One thing we have forgotten is that individual parts cannot be perfected with a preset. there's always the performance aspect that is always involved. And because of that performance aspect, if our performance isn't good, neither is our song. But sometimes people will use those templates and presets to kind of get the sounds that they need. But they don't. But everything is all found in the human element of what we do. What I do is I use in my processes and the way I mix, and sometimes even the way I create music, I always have what they call a template or a preset, and I use that as a starting point. For example, if I have a template or a preset of a drum sound that I like to mix, and all the rest of the parts around the drum sound, I try to make sure I get all those parts to match together, or I get the mix to fit around the drums. So there's a process. I'll be with the vocals. I'll start the vocals first, or if there's guitars, I'll put guitars in there. Then eventually I'll put the bass in later. Now, if there's some sort of parts of the drum sound that are not cutting through, I'll adjust some bit of the drum kit. But if the whole bit of the mix outside of the drums aren't sounding good, then I'll adjust the whole mix. I'll adjust all the whole mix except for the drum part. So that way it could sound the way I want it to sound. The templates and the presets that I use, they're not always set in stone. So it allows me to be able to bring that human element to know what I'm hearing. Now, some people in this respect will always try to find some way to dismiss the whole argument as far as, for whatever reason. Anthony Fantano, who's a well-known YouTuber, basically a music critic, and I mean he does play bass and stuff like that. He tried to point out the argument of using Frank Sinatra. Now he mentioned that Frank Sinatra, the reason why he was so good at what he did because he had a whole bunch of people involved, and that's why the music was able to sound good the way it did. But then again, I don't think he understood that he shot his own foot when he did that, when he made that argument. Music production takes work. In Frank Sinatra's case, he mentioned that there was teams like conductors, producers, audio engineers, and people that were needed at the time to help the record to go off nice and easy. However, even though there was people in the production, Frank Sinatra, or otherwise known as Old Blue Eyes, still had to put the work of his voice into the production of that song to sound great. And a lot of times it's because he practiced that. He was always staying on top of his game, even despite of his drinking. That's why he was always known by this other nickname, One Take Frank. This is why I agree with Rick on this, as far as, feeling that there's always something missing nowadays. And a lot of times it goes into this one point, which is where it's really going to get where it gets a little bit heated, and this is where a lot of the whole argument of what this has done, which is to explode to this, which is the vibrance of the music. As I mentioned, with the use of technology, it can be, I'll sum it up like this. It could be a blessing or a curse. Now, as we've heard the stories and things like that of certain types of technology that affects music in certain ways. Now, Anthony Fantano, when he was arguing this point regarding Rick Beato, because his video was actually the most prominent one that was out there. Technology like drum machines have become part of creating music. And when Anthony Fantano mentioned that, yes, he is correct. It has, drum machines have become a part of creating music, but then again, he stated artists of the 80s. But the first person who actually did that was Sly Stone of Sly and the Family Stone. He was one of the earliest users of the drum machine. He used it in a song called Family Affair back in 1971. Now, another person who kind of followed suit with that was actually the well-known, most recorded drum machine song that was involved was Phil Collins when he used the drum machine in the epic drum song In the Air of Night. But to give the song the power that it needed, we all know of that iconic drum intro while the drum machine's going on. So when it comes to the drum machines, these artists, they didn't just use the drum machines. They put the vibe in the music while using the drum machines. It was a creative tool in creating their songs and in writing them. Now, the flip side would be in regards of John Bonham. One thing about John Bonham is that he always had some sort of a nuance in his drumming. And some of those songs gave the Led Zeppelin the vibe and the feel of where their music should go. It was just the way John Bonham had played it. But when you really come down and think about it, there was a song written by Mississippi Minnie called When the Levee Breaks. And believe it or not, at the time, even though there wasn't much technique to get the drum sound in there, because it's very interesting in how that happened. However, when you really listen to the drum beat, it's actually the most sampled drum beat in hip hop. You can think of NWO, Ice Cube, Ice-T, all the early rappers. They always went to that particular song because it had a vibe to it. It had a sound to it that a drum machine could not replicate. When it comes to technology, again, they're supposed to be tools, not the end-all be-all. Here's where some fail to see the argument. I remember I was watching a video of Stuart Copeland with Sheila E. And in their conversation, she always talked about grace notes and how they're so hard to play. Now, imagine trying to create a grace note or ghost note with a drum machine. It's not really easy. I even tried it. It's the drum machines, even despite of some of the new technology that's out there, it's still difficult to do. Now, again, this is not to minimize the argument for both sides, okay? Because I'll give you an example. Sometimes, when I started out, I had to use a drum machine. That's the only way I was able to kind of get my songs out. Now, if a drummer came along, he kind of said, well, how can I play better? Let me get a little bit more of this. Then it would help the song along go even better. Now, someone who actually did this is one of my favorite guitar players, Joe Satriani. When Joe Satriani was recording Surfing with the Alien, he only had $13,000 on a budget to work with. Instead of having to suffer and to try to, wait a little longer to record, to hire session musicians, which would have been really over the top, he was able to create a platinum album using a drum machine. And once he got a little bit more notoriety, which I believe was after the Flying in a Blue Dream album, when he created the Extremist album, he was able to hire Greg Bissonette and Matthew Bissonette, his brother, to play on the album. When it comes to using technology, it becomes a means to an end at times. Side of this issue is also the people that would always say this, you gotta play to a grid. But then there's some that will be like Hamlet, not to play to a grid. Now, here's where the argument really gets ugly. Now, Jordan Valerian, who we all know is a very good producer, especially of hardcore metal, he says you can still have feel in drumming and yet still be snapped to a grid. Now, in my personal experience with me and my drummer, it is possible, but you better bring your A game. Some engineers, because of that, if there's some quirks or some flaws in the recording, some of them don't mind going into editing. But I remember when Warren Hewitt said about this in regards of that process, I think he even said, quote, that this can make a song stale. So he prefers having a good performance over having a good recording. And I think this is where a lot of people go wrong. Because when you start using editing tools, your playing becomes mediocre. You start settling for mediocrity. And what happens is that it shows through the music. And worse, it shows through your live performance. If a musician is allowed to give a subpar performance and is told that their performances can be fixed, then there's really no incentive or no motivation for them to want to improve. And again, that becomes a killer. The argument can be made for both sides. That when you learn to embrace both worlds, it makes you a better musician all the way around. And I think this is where Rick Beato was making his whole argument on. In conclusion, I have been in both worlds of this in regards to this argument. I have known what it is to be all in my life, to be a musician, to embrace technology and creating it. And throughout the years as a musician and an up-and-coming audio engineer, have used technology to help myself and let alone to help others so they can come out with the best audio recording than me. But then again, you never want to eliminate the human element, because that's what makes music very beautiful. That's just my thoughts. So if anything, let me know down in the comment section, and let's go ahead and get this conversation rolling, because I think this is something that needs to be talked about a lot more often, something that needs to be addressed. Some people are okay with dealing with the technology and being able to be set up the way it's been, but then again, there's also times you really need that full feeling. So until next time, peace out.